now as Americans, and for those of us who are Catholic, as American Catholics. The second theme, closer to the current circumstance, and very much what Jared was talking about at the beginning, is I want to argue that a politics of culture wars is antithetical to both the words and the spirit of Vatican II. I believe that culture wars exploit our discontents when the task of politics is actually to heal them. And I think Catholics share with the Jewish tradition the obligation, the idea that we have an obligation to heal the world and not to divide it further. Let me start with what Pope John has to say. We might think about these words as we partake in political decisions in the wake of a very divisive campaign. I'm going to quote a bit from his encyclical Pacem in Terris. It is a remarkable document. The most famous line was his call for an end to the arms race. Nuclear weapons must be banned, he said. But I'd like to focus primarily on other parts of the encyclical, which still read so well. Every individual, Pope John wrote, is endowed with intelligence and free will. As such, he has rights and duties, which together flow as a direct consequence from his nature. These rights and duties are universal and inviolable, and therefore altogether inalienable. He has the right also to be accurately informed about public affairs. I love a pope who prays for journalists. He has a natural right to share in the benefits of culture and hence to receive a good general education. It is evident that a man has the inherent right not only to be given the opportunity to work, but also to be allowed the exercise of personal initiative in the work that he does. He has the right to the private ownership of property, but the right to own private property entails a social obligation as well. Rights match duties, he insisted. And now here is a great line. It's something you might say to your kids some night. He said, "To claim one's rights and ignore one's duties or only half fulfill them is like building a house with one hand and tearing it down with the other." Now, one other remarkable thing I want to quote. Remember that Pacem in Terris was written in 1963. That was the same year that Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique. And here is what the good Pope John said about the rights of women. In 1963, in the family, he said, both the man and woman enjoy equal rights and equal duties. Women are gaining an increasing awareness of their natural dignity. Far from being content with a purely passive role or allowing themselves to be regarded as a kind of instrument, they are demanding, both in domestic and in public life, the rights and duties which belong to them as human persons. The long-standing inferior, and again, remember that this is the Pope in 1963. He said the long-standing inferiority complex of certain classes because of their economic and social status, sex, or position in the state, and the corresponding superiority complex of other classes is rapidly becoming a thing of the past. I wonder if he was talking about 47% there, but never mind. And lastly, again, 1963 is the year of the Great Civil Rights March, and he said flatly that truth calls for the elimination of every trace of racial discrimination. For those of you who are interested, I suggest you sit down with Pacem in Terris because it goes on and says remarkable things that I think still instruct us today. I just have to say that he noted that the attainment of the common good is the sole reason for the existence of civil authorities. And that's, I think, the proper way to think about government. Now, I can quote the good Pope John at great length, and as a liberal, a lot of these words make me happy. And so I do want to confess here something that I think all of us these days can be guilty of, particularly when we mix politics and religion. which is that we always are looking to religion not for inspiration or enlightenment or to make us think harder. We tend to be looking for sanctions for our own political views going in. And C.S. Lewis had a very nice line on this many years ago when he suggested that we ransack our creeds to justify whatever conclusion we reach at the beginning. Most of us, C.S. Lewis said, are not really he was speaking of Christians here, most of us, C.S. Lewis said, are not really approaching the subject to find out what Christianity says. We are approaching it in the hope of finding support from Christianity for the views of our own political party. This is something I think all of us should plead guilty to, and then we might usefully do something about it. Yet I would still insist that if you are, whether you are a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or a Sikh or a Buddhist or an atheist, the inner balances of Pope John's worldview reflect a humanistic and communitarian view of human possibility that still has a great deal to teach us. We have rights, but we also have duties. We have the right to own property, but that ownership carries a social obligation that the Catholic Church has sometimes referred to as a social mortgage. I really like the idea of a social mortgage. Human rights and duties are rendered totally ineffective, Pope John said, in the absence of public action to support them. But this view presumes that there is such a thing as community, that there is such a thing as the common good, that is more than just the sum of our own individual preferences. It presumes that individuals can best express themselves and can most successfully exercise their rights within a community. But do we really value community? I think it's not fashionable to say so these days, but all of us do owe a debt to the French Revolution's trinity of values: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And more than 200 years later, I think that it's not surprising that fraternity ranked behind liberty and equality, because on the conservative side these days, one hears always about liberty, one often hears about equality from the left. We don't talk enough about community. It often gets lost in the shuffle. But I think that the quest for community inherent in John's encyclical should be a humane cause that engages liberals, conservatives, and social democrats alike. I want to pause just for a second because Joaquin kindly mentioned my new book, and my new book really is an argument from tradition, as is a talk about Vatican II. The core argument of my book, the reason why I say we have a divided political heart, is that I believe that from the beginning we Americans have been torn by a great tension between our love of individualism and liberty and our affection for and quest for community. And I think our recent politics has gone off the rails because we have almost totally forgotten about the communitarian strain in American life that goes right back to the founding. I always like to ask this to audiences because I love what I hear in response. What is the first word of the Constitution of the United States? Exactly. Doesn't it sound great when a group of citizens say the word we? We, the people of the United States. By the way, it does say that one purpose is to provide for the general welfare. I also like to point out that welfare is right there in the first paragraph of the Constitution of the United States. And I think if you go back through our story, and I could do this with the Declaration of Independence as well, that you understand that we have been about both these things, liberty and community, and not just one of these things. And speaking as a progressive, I want to acknowledge a debt to the Tea Party. Because while the book I wrote is very critical of the Tea Party and its ideas, I think the Tea Party performed a useful service in calling us back to our founding and our founding documents and to make us think about who we are in light of our origins. And I don't think that we progressives should leave the American story to our friends on the conservative side, because I think this is a profoundly progressive story, our American story. I don't think they should be the only ones who carry around pocket copies of the Constitution, because it is our Constitution too, beginning with that wonderful word, we. And I think that we need to challenge them because their view of our story is one-sided, and I think that's something that came out in the course of the last election campaign. But I think in the wake of the election and having settled these fights, we might think a little bit about how we might come together across some of these lines that divide us, and maybe encourage our friends on the right to re-engage in their own best communitarian tradition. So I'll begin by criticizing us on the liberal side just a bit. A great writer called Alan Wolfe wrote a book called Who's Keeper many years ago, and he argued that the conventional political debate too often casts the government and the market as the main forms of social organization. And what that happens to leave out are all of the social institutions so vital in most people's lives: family, neighborhood, church, synagogue, mosque, workplace, sports teams, fellowships, sports leagues, and the fellowships created in taverns like Cheers. Remember Cheers? That was the place where everyone knows your name. Each of these civic institutions is affected by the workings of government and the market, but they are a distinct form. They are independent of both. And as Alan Wolfe wrote, liberal democracies face discontents because they tend to rely either on individualistic moral codes associated with the markets or collective moral codes associated with the state. Yet neither of these codes successfully addresses all of the issues that confront society. Popular discontent with right or left polarization rests on the intelligent intuition that radical free market conservatives are wrong if they suggest that markets can address and cure all that ails us, and that left liberals and social democrats are wrong if we argue that our salvation comes only through the perfection of government programs. Václav Havel, the brilliant intellectual and rebel of Eastern Europe, offered a critique of all soulless materialist systems. He argued that under communism, we learn not to believe in anything, to ignore each other, and to care only about ourselves. Concepts such as love and friendship and compassion and humility and forgiveness lost their depth and dimensions. The old regime, Havel said, reduced man to a force of production and a simple tool of production. The system reduced gifted and autonomous people to nuts and bolts of some monstrously huge, noisy, and stinking machine whose real meaning was not clear to anyone. Now, I think Havel's critique of communism bears a remarkable similarity to traditionalist complaints about modernity and also to criticisms of unregulated capitalism. And I think that's where the Catholic tradition that I revere can be so profoundly useful. The larger Catholic tradition, particularly as reflected in Vatican II, has always provided us with a kind of third way between what you might call a materialist left and a materialist right. It's insisted on the primacy of the spiritual. It seems to me that at its best, the Catholic social teaching, with its emphasis on both subsidiarity and solidarity, its insistence on both social and personal responsibility, and its embrace of both freedom and conscience and community, could provide an antidote for some of modernity's discontents. Catholicism, with its sense of balance, its emphasis on the reality of sin, and the always present possibility of salvation, should actually be opposed to culture war politics. It should not be fomenting them. And that's the other point I want to make. Why should we be opposed to the politics of culture wars? We should be opposed because culture war politics is rooted in an arrogant moral superiority, not in a self-aware form of discernment. It's been fashionable in the American political discussion to separate those social issues from economic issues, but the two, as Catholics in particular should insist, are always intertwined. Most Americans, no matter which cultural battle they want to fight or avoid, understand this. Family life, for example, is powerfully affected by work arrangements and by the ability to find decently paying jobs. Community life is shaped by how we build our homes and our neighborhoods, by how long people's commutes are, by how much time is left over from the struggle to make a living, to devote to family, to community, and to civic work. Our culture is shaped in large part by commercial forces that paradoxically promote a permissiveness in entertainment and advertising that conservatives who in theory revere the market, in fact constantly deplore. We don't live in the opposing boxes that the culture wars create. Cultural conservatives who have gay friends cannot abide prejudice against homosexuals. Opponents of abortion often cannot find it in themselves to condemn a woman they know who had an abortion for a reason they understand, even if they are passionately opposed to abortion. Many supporters of abortion rights can find the issue as morally troubling as pro-lifers do and might never choose to have an abortion themselves. Many, in short, value freedom and also understands freedom's limits and challenges. Many also long for orthodoxy, but they somehow want their orthodoxy to be flexible on something that matters to their own sense of freedom. One of my favorite lines from my friend David Brooks, with whom I argue about politics on the radio, is a line he got when he spoke to a rabbi in Montana who invented a wonderful word. The wonderful word was flexodoxy. And what the rabbi noted in his conversation with my friend David is that while a lot of people say they are looking for orthodoxy, most of the time they want their orthodoxy to be flexible about something that matters to them. And David introduced us in his book to a group he called bourgeois bohemians, who are definitely a flexodox group. Or think about the counterculture that we used to talk about in the 60s, or at least those of us who are old enough to have been around then. It's been transformed into a kind of over-the-counter culture. And this this transformation actually makes liberals and conservatives just a little bit unhappy. Liberals who definitely don't want to be blue-nosed or judgmental are nonetheless very uneasy with a consumerist, individualistic culture that often violates their own sense of community and decency and mutual obligation. Conservatives who dread economic regulation and defend capitalism at every turn often find the cultural fruits of capitalism quite distasteful. And liberals and conservatives may battle over gay marriage or abortion, yet they agree wholeheartedly on which television programs their children shouldn't watch, which websites they shouldn't visit, and which video games they shouldn't play. Both are likely to be critical of the culture of malls, and for the same reason. A friend of mine who is an arch conservative taught me something very important when he said, a social conservative is a liberal with a daughter in high school. I have two of them. I think we'd be better off if we challenged this whole culture war metaphor because we don't live our own lives like that, and I don't think we should try to live other people's lives in the context of a culture war. In the process, I think we might challenge ourselves a bit, both as liberals and as conservatives. You need not be a cultural pessimist to worry about the state of our common life, but you needn't be a wild-eyed optimist to see signs that for all the disruptions wrought by our recent economic troubles and all the moral challenges we face, we Americans are trying to create new forms of community and new ways of transmitting old values and virtues. Now, I want to bring all this down to earth and close with two examples. I want to turn to two recent episodes, one well-known and the other less well-known, to illustrate what I'm suggesting about the cost of culture wars, which again I think is antithetical to the spirit that Vatican II brought upon us and the great joy that Pope John talked about. Culture wars almost always require partisans to denigrate the moral legitimacy of their opponents. Sometimes we even deny their very humanity. It's often not enough to defeat a foe. Satisfaction only comes from an adversary's humiliation. This, I would submit, should be especially problematic for people who call themselves Christian. It is not a very Christian attitude. The other thing about culture wars is that one side typically has absolutely no understanding of what the other side is trying to say. It is as if we are talking different languages. And these are all in play in that great debate that we discussed a bit during the last campaign over whether our religious institutions should be required to cover contraception under the new health care law. It's why that debate was so painful. It is why, I would say, as somebody who is on the left side of politics, why it was hard to comprehend, for me at least, why President Obama, who himself is an eloquent critic of culture wars, did not try to diffuse this explosive question from the beginning. It is also why I believe he was right later on to try to reach a compromise that responded to the legitimate concerns of each side. I think he would have been better off doing this at the outset, but I'd also say better late than never. Now, many liberal Catholics of my kind actually supported the Church's core claim, and this surprised both Catholic conservatives and more secular liberals. They didn't expect us, neither side did, to be where we were at the beginning of this fight, and I think there are lessons here too. Those of us who are liberal Catholics have remained in the Church for reasons beyond tribal loyalty. We stay in the Church for more than just a desire to honor the traditions of our parents and our grandparents, though those are important to us. At the heart of the love many of us feel for the Church, despite our frustrations over the pedophilia scandal, despite the Church's reluctance to grant women some of those rights that Pope John talked about, is a profound respect for the fact that on so many questions that count, Catholicism has actually walked its talk. It harnesses faith to the good works of the gospel. And remember those nuns on the bus who rolled through the country during this last presidential campaign, who reminded us in a powerful way about the Church's commitment to social justice. When it comes to lifting up the poor, healing the sick, assisting immigrants and refugees, educating the young, comforting the orphaned and abandoned children, and organizing the needy to act in their own interest, the Church has been there for a century with resources and an astoundingly committed band of sisters and priests and brothers and lay people. Organizations such as Catholic Charities, Catholic Health Association, the Campaign for Human Development, the Catholic Relief Services make the words of Jesus come alive every day. For liberals who sided with the Church initially in this controversy, the most vexing problem with the original exemption on contraception was the fact that it defined the word religious so narrowly that the reality that these organizations go out of their way to serve non-Catholics was actually held against them. Their gospel-inspired work was defined as non-religious if it involved serving those outside the Church. That violated the very essence of Christian charity and the Church's social justice imperatives. Now, some conservative Catholics and some of our bishops still insist that the relief from the regulation that Obama offered is not enough. I would like them to reconsider this now that we are facing a new 4-year period. I'd like them to reconsider because many Catholic service providers who are most affected by these revised rules welcome the changes. What bothers those of us who are more liberal Catholics about the argument advanced by some of our conservative friends is that the religious right seems so eager to focus the Church's witness on issues such as abortion, gay marriage, stem cell research, and now contraception. They wish to do this to such a degree that they would effectively, if not in all cases necessarily intentionally, relegate the Church's social justice teaching and all the work that it does on the ground to a kind of second-class status in its public message to Catholics and its public message about the Church to non-Catholics. Liberal Catholics were proud to stand with our conservative brothers and sisters in defending the Church's religious liberty rights so it can carry out its social and charitable mission. Now, we'd like to ask our conservative friends to consider that what makes the gospel so compelling, especially for the young, is the central role it assigns to our responsibilities to act on behalf of the needy and of the left out and of the abandoned. And we'd ask our non-Catholic liberal friends and our non-religious liberal friends to think about this too. Many of us, I for one, agreed that broad contraception coverage is in fact a good thing. We share with our fellow liberals a concern for women's rights. But we were troubled that some with whom we usually agree seem to relish a fight with the church and define any effort to accommodate it as a form of selling out. Again, I think culture war politics does not serve us well. There was a young politician, I think, who put the whole matter in proper perspective back in 2006. And here's what that young politician said, and I quote him: "There are some liberals who dismiss religion in the public square as inherently irrational or intolerant, insisting on a caricature of religious Americans that paints them as fanatical, or thinking that the very word Christian describes one's political opponents, not people of faith." The person who said this is named Barack Obama. He spoke those words, and he finally figured out a compromise on the contraception matter, which I think reflected what he told us he believed all along. And I hope our president and our administration doesn't lose track of that guy again. And I hope that guy comes back and tries to bring us together on some of these questions, because I think he really does have the capacity to do it. The second one I want to touch on briefly is much more obscure, but it gives me a chance to do something I don't do that often, which is to have something reasonably nice to say about Rick Santorum. It was during the 2011 debates, a debate in 2011, and that was at a moment when Republicans were absolutely obsessed with the number 9. Remember Herman Cain and 999? Wouldn't it have been interesting to have a whole campaign about 999? But in the middle of all that obsession, Rick Santorum talked about the breakdown of the American family and its relationship to poverty during a debate. And I think his words deserve more attention than they got at the time. He said, "You want to look at the poverty rate among families that have a husband and a wife working in them. It's 5% today. A family that's headed by one person, it's 30% today. We need to do something." That's the end of the quote. He noted that the word home in Greek is the basis of the word economy, and he argued for a policy that supports family, that encourages marriage, and has fathers take responsibility for their children. He added, "You can't have a wealthy society if the family breaks down." Now, in many ways, Santorum is actually broadly right. According to the Columbia University's National Center for Children in Poverty, in the 2005 to 2009 period, 5% of married households were poor within a given year, compared to 28.8% of single-parent households. For 2010, the figures were 8.4% and 39.6%, respectively. And this is actually one issue on which Rick Santorum and Barack Obama have found themselves on the same side. Barack Obama said at one point that children that grow up without a father are more likely to live in poverty. That's a quote from the president. He said this at a Father's Day event, quotes, "They're more likely to drop out of school, they're more likely to wind up in prison, they're more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, they're more likely to end up with being teenage parents themselves. Growing up without a father," the president added, "leaves a hole in a child's life that no government can fill." Now, you would think that when Barack Obama and Rick Santorum agree on something, we might actually try to do something about it once we get past our divisions. But we can't seem to get past our divisions. For one thing we should not do is blame gays and lesbians for disrupting the heterosexual family. I always like to say that we straight people have done a fine job of wrecking the family all by ourselves. And if we care about the family, we ought to look to ourselves and how we behave to find the things that we should change. Santorum took a different view. He once said that marriage, if same-sex marriage becomes law, then becomes to some degree meaningless. Now, honestly, I don't care where you stand on gay marriage, I have not been able to compute that because I just can't see how my marriage or your marriage is rendered meaningless if gay and lesbian couples decide to make a lifelong commitment to each other. Indeed, I think one of the striking things is how conservative a demand gay marriage actually is. And it was indeed regarded as a conservative demand within the gay rights movement when it first came up. It was rooted in, as my friend John Rausch, an advocate of gay marriage, has said, in a communitarian and family-minded emphasis on civic responsibilities. But in an area where we might have more concord, I think liberals should acknowledge, as Obama has, that strengthening the family without bashing other people is vital to economic justice. And I think conservatives should acknowledge that economic justice is vital to strengthening families. For example, our national policies on sick leave and family leave are among the most anti-family in the developed world. When faced with a choice between the needs of the family and the needs of employers, we almost always tilt toward employers. Other nations, influenced by Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, have done much more to make work compatible with family life. I think we need to think about that more. Conservatives often say that tax policies could be more helpful to families raising children, and I agree, but these benefits should not become another excuse simply to cut taxes on wealthy people. The impact of the single-family parent on the well-being of children has sometimes been an explosive matter because it is often discussed in relationship to the African-American community. And Obama himself has made that link explicit. Now, the truth is this is a problem and a difficulty that is spreading across all of the races, but I do think we need to face the fact that young black men in our country, many of them find themselves in a crisis situation, and rather than avoid the issue which is a temptation for conservatives, or to pretend, for liberals rather, or to pretend that public policy can do little about it, a temptation for conservatives, we need to make their plight a very high priority. Now, it doesn't demean the heroic work of dedicated single moms to say that the two-parent families have a better shot at prosperity. But I would offer this unusual Santorum-Obama alliance as an example of where we might create some openings where things have been so closed off for so long. I opened with the words of Pope John, and I want to close with them. I think his words that he spoke on October 11th, 1962, in opening the council, are as much a guide to us today as they were 50 years ago. Pope John urged us to look to the future without fear. In fact, he said, by bringing herself up to date where required, and by the wise organization of communal cooperation, the Church will make men, families, and peoples really turn their minds to heavenly things. He expressed some impatience at some point. He said, in the daily exercise of our pastoral office, we sometimes have to listen, much to our regret, to voices of persons who, though burning with zeal, are not endowed with too much sense of discretion or measure. In these modern times, they can see nothing but prevarication and ruin. They say that our era, in comparison with past eras, is getting worse, and they behave as though they have learned nothing from history, which is nonetheless the teacher of life. They behave as though, at the time of former councils, everything was full of triumph for the Christian era and life, and for proper religious liberty. And then he said, we feel we must disagree with those prophets of gloom who are always forecasting disaster as though the end of the world were at hand. And I think we too should disagree with those prophets of gloom. Pope John spoke of the church and its traditions and its doctrines this way. Our duty is not only to guard this precious treasure as if it were concerned only with antiquity, but to dedicate ourselves with an earnest will and without fear to that work which our era demands of us, pursuing thus the path which the church has followed for 20 centuries. And that still defines our obligation. We too must dedicate ourselves with an earnest will to the work that this era demands. We must honor the traditions of old without fear of the future. As the great religious writer Yaroslav Pelikan has noted, tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead religion of the living. We will keep our faith alive by understanding that the world in which we live is not infallible and needs correction. But we will also keep faith and hope alive by seeing that modernity, too, is a gift from God, a God who has not abandoned us and who gave us hearts and minds that we will continue to use to seek the truth that will set us all free. Thank you all very much for being here.
As well. So please bring your questions forward. Thanks.
And I just want to say I welcome dissenting questions. I told the story of my conservative uncle I argued politics with, and it was one of the sweet things in my life. When he passed away, his kids, my cousins, asked me to give the eulogy because they knew how much I loved him. And in the middle of the eulogy, I couldn't resist quoting Richard Nixon. And it was actually a Richard Nixon quote I liked. But as I told the people in the church, I also quoted Richard Nixon because I was so hoping that my Uncle Ray would come back to life and pop out of that casket just to look at me and say, I knew you'd be quoting Nixon someday. So I do welcome dissent as well as friendly questions, though. And I also like to tell people no one likes to ask the first question, so think of this as the second question. Otherwise, I'm just, see, when you teach in university, you can actually draft people and just pull them out. Father, thank you.
I come out of I come out of the Protestant tradition, so I may be ignorant on this, but it seems to me, from what I read, that there is a move toward conservatism in the Catholic Church. So can you address what's happening there? We see that in our own Archbishop here in Colorado.
Well, I think that, to put this in a recent historical context, the Catholic Church is, as a Protestant would be the first to point out to us, a hierarchical church. And so a great deal depends upon appointments from Rome. And if you go back to the bishops who led the Catholic Church in the 70s and 80s, they were appointed in large part by Pope Paul VI. And they tended to be on the more progressive or moderate or progressive side of Catholicism, probably exemplified by the great Archbishop of Chicago, Joseph Bernardin. And you could see that in the fruits of their work. And the church didn't change its position on a lot of on these issues. The church has always been a pro-life church, for example. But so much of the emphasis of its public mission was on social justice, on war and peace. In the mid-'80s, the bishops wrote 2 pastoral letters, which involved intense consultation with the Catholic laity, that were seen as quite critical of the Reagan administration on war and peace issues and on social justice questions. And Cardinal Bernardin talked about what he called the seamless garment, where the right to life was connected to the right of the poor to sustenance and decent opportunity, to seeing war as a last resort, to opposition to the death penalty. And he saw this as a whole. In the papacy of Pope John Paul II, and particularly as the papacy went on, and I covered John Paul in the Vatican in Rome from 84 to 86. Those appointees were more conservative. We journalists would joke when he named Cardinal Law in Boston and Cardinal O'Connor in New York that they were sometimes referred to as law and order. And so you had they were referred that way by their friends as well as those who were critical of them. And so you've had a change in the leadership of the church. And again, it's not I think the battle in the Catholic Church is not specifically over the formal positions in the church. You don't have a big lobbying effort to change the church's teaching on abortion. What it's about is whether the church's public witness will be defined primarily by abortion and gay rights and this particular view of religious liberty that I guess your bishop did the advertisement on, versus this long-standing emphasis that the church had on social justice questions. Another famous Catholic document it was the bishop's 1919 program for social reconstruction, which in many ways presaged a New Deal. A lot of New Deal ideas were in that document, reflecting a broadly progressive perspective that was around at that period. So there's been a change in the leadership of the church, but I think what was valuable about the witness of the nuns on the bus during this campaign is that it showed that there are a great many Catholics who still want the church's emphasis, still believe that the church's emphasis should be on these social justice questions, who point out, for example, that one of the best things we could do to reduce the number of abortions in the country is to reduce the level of poverty and to help poor women. And so I think this struggle is going to go forward after this campaign. Now, the bishops are not a uniform group. If you look during the presidential election campaign, the political voice of the church was different in different dioceses. I think in my diocese of Washington, it was less pronounced on one side of the debate than it was in other dioceses, perhaps this one, around the country. And the bishops are meeting this week, and I think there's going to be a real reflection, because I happen to know there are bishops who don't think the church should look like it's siding with one side of the political debate. We did a poll, we here being a colleague and I at Brookings and a group called the Public Religion Research Institute, where we specifically asked the question, do you think the Catholic Church should preach primarily about social justice and the poor and the need to help the poor, even if that means talking less about abortion and the right to life, or should it preach more on abortion and the right to life, even if that means talking less about social justice and the poor? Among Catholics overall, it was 2-to-1 in favor of social justice. Among weekly church mass attenders, it was 51-38 in favor of social justice. So this is, I think, a fair reflection of where the church is, and I think we have a big debate ahead of us, and we're in the middle of a big debate now, and I think it'll carry on into the future. Please.
Yeah, EJ, would you comment on the fascinating dichotomy on the Republican presidential ticket this election cycle, represented by Mitt Romney's Mormonism and Paul Ryan's conservative Catholicism, please?
Well, not only that, I'm glad you, that's an old Richard Nixon line, by the way, I'm glad you asked that question. Do you remember, some of you may remember that. Not only that, this is the first ticket in American history that doesn't have a white Protestant on it. There was one Protestant on both tickets, and he was African American, which is really, I think, quite a remarkable, wonderful thing about America, I have to say. So, 2 Catholics, a Mormon, and an African American Protestant. And there are a couple of things. One is, I am really happy that there was not an upsurge of anti-Mormonism in this campaign. I think that Democrats actually did seem to show some discipline about this. I didn't hear anything about sub-rosa anti-Mormon politicking, and that's a very good thing. I think that it didn't show up very much among evangelical Christians, white evangelical Christians in the election, though it did to some degree in the primary. I mean, it is worth noting that while the competitive primaries were on, Mitt Romney did not win a primary in a state where evangelical Christians cast a majority of the ballots. So there was some effect in the primary, but it didn't carry over, sadly, probably for some negative reasons, which is for a certain number of evangelical Christians, their dislike of President Obama overcame whatever qualms they might have had about voting for a Mormon. Nonetheless, I think there was a good small d Democratic discipline in the country about this, and we should welcome that. Beyond that, Catholics, as I say, Catholics are a 40-40-20 group. They are an important piece of part of both political parties, and for goodness sake, they are absolutely dominant on the United States Supreme Court right now, which, well, I'll leave it right there. There are both kinds of Catholics on the United States Supreme Court right now. And so beyond that, I'm curious if you can shout out from wherever you are, how else would you like me to reflect on that? Or what was in the back of your head when you asked that question? Where are you?
I'm here.
Yeah.
What was Mitt Romney thinking?
About electing his running mate as a conservative Catholic, and what might Paul Ryan be thinking as a conservative Catholic to accept that invitation?
Oh, well, ambition for I mean, first of all, I think that, again, it goes back to something I said earlier in the talk. A lot of times, the labels, Paul Ryan is a conservative Catholic. That is exactly who he is. And yet, I think his identification in the country was much more as a conservative than as a conservative Catholic, as the conservative who gave us the Paul Ryan budget. There was some interesting controversy over his love of Ayn Rand, who is not exactly someone comfortable in the Catholic social tradition. And he actually has had to switch his take on Ayn Rand, for political reasons. It was once his hero. But I think that Romney chose Ryan because I think he was trying to find some way to finally quiet dissent on the right and open the way to trying to move somewhere else, which he didn't really get around to doing until late in the campaign when he tried to sort of move more toward the political middle. But I think that's what Ryan was about. And Ryan accepted it because it was a great political opportunity, although actually the fate of losing vice presidential candidates is not great if you look at past examples. No offense to Paul Ryan. I mean, it's not a great gig, but you get a lot of attention. It gives you some opportunities down the road. Sir.
I'd like to ask a question of you as a political scientist. We in Colorado were privileged to be a swing state. And
you probably will be for a long time. I have never gotten a vote in a swing state. I'm really jealous of you guys. Maryland, Massachusetts, New York. These are, anyway.
Right. How do you view the endurance of the Electoral College? It appears now that with our abilities to track data, they're tracking individual voters on a very real-time sense, and identifying very small geographic areas that will swing elections. And it changes the nature of a campaign from 50 years ago, I think. How do you think that will impact our Electoral College over a long term?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I mean, there's fascinating stuff that's come out about the skill of the Obama campaign in identifying not only slivers of swing voters, but what shows they watch on the most obscure cable channels you can imagine. And just to answer your question, I have been for quite some time in favor of the direct election of the president by popular vote. I think the Electoral College was designed as at a more elitist time when the founders had some mistrust of popular majorities. When the Constitution was written, I think it was only 25% of adult men had an opportunity to vote in the elections that ratified it. And we really didn't even have universal white male suffrage until the end of the Jacksonian period. And so the whole idea of the Electoral College was anti-democratic, the same reason we used to elect senators by the state legislators used to pick senators and not the people. So I would be for moving to direct election. There are some problems with the political scientists will argue that a national system with multiple candidates could lead to a minority president, but we seem to have that with the Electoral College. I recall that happening 12 years ago. And I think the possibility of the Electoral College blowing up is too great. I mean, in this election, Barack Obama has something close to a 3 million popular vote majority, but it wouldn't take, I think 150,000 votes swung in the right places would have given the election to Romney. In 2004, 120,000 votes swung to Kerry in Ohio would have given him the Electoral College, even though Bush had about a 2.5 million popular vote majority. I just think this raises all kinds of difficulties for us. And, also, whoever had the idea of having an equal number of electors, there was actually there were several very plausible paths to getting to a tie in this last election. Let's at least create one more member of Congress so we can get rid of that nightmare. Or I suppose if I would compromise with my conservative friends if they want to create one fewer, member. And so, I don't know, but as far as these methods go, every cycle produces new innovations in how to appeal to voters, and they all sound somewhat more magical than they actually are. In 2004, Karl Rove was said to have some kind of magical machine, and that didn't seem to endure very long. And I also think these cycles of innovation, in campaigns like in business, when one company or one candidate or one party engages with them, the other party figures out a way to catch up. I don't see anything unique about this as a sort of democratic gift, although the Democrats do, I think, now have more confidence in person-to-person campaigning on the ground. And the Republicans and conservatives have a little less confidence in actual data if you look at their response to some of the polls in this election. And I do hope, I actually talked with my friend Brooks about this. I said, I've argued with conservatives for years, but they never used to deny data that was data. And I hope they get over this, in polls and maybe in global warming and a couple of other areas. Ma'am.
This is a Catholic question, okay?
Yes.
For some reason or other, this whole election time, I thought a lot about Dorothy Day. And I wondered if she'd be arrested if she were functioning these days. I was just thinking, what do you think about Dorothy Day and the whole Catholic worker movement, if it were to arise again at this particular time?
How many people in the audience know who Dorothy Day is? Oh, what a great audience. For those of you who don't, Dorothy Day was the founder of the Catholic worker movement. Dorothy Day was actually an ex-communist who left the Communist Party, joined the Catholic Church, and she was a radical and a pacifist, kind of an agrarian. The Catholic worker had a farm. They set up houses of hospitality that still exist in some of the very poorest neighborhoods in the country. There was one in Denver for a long time. It's still there. Yeah, God bless them. And the Catholic Worker still was a newspaper, still sells for a penny a copy. And they have this great woodcut of kind of Christ the Worker as their logo. It's one of the great logos. Actually, I have my religious relic in my office at Georgetown is a letter from Dorothy Day to a friend of my late mother's. So I revere Dorothy Day. She's much more radical than I am. She would probably regard me as a sellout. I'm much more of a liberal or a social democrat. I'm not a pacifist, but I love Dorothy Day. And I've been thinking a lot about that question too, because there was a book by a guy called Bill O'Rourke about the Harrisburg Seven and the Catholic pacifists and radicals of the anti-war period that just came. He just sent me a new edition of the book. And I realized we don't hear from Catholic radicals hardly at all. The very notion that there were Catholic radicals, not just liberals, but radicals, would astonish so many people today. And yet, of course, the gospel itself is radical. Jesus was in so many ways a radical that it was natural. Now, you asked the question, would Dorothy Day be arrested today? Of course she would, because she was arrested in her own lifetime. She got arrested all the time. What would the bishops make of her? is an interesting question. And I don't know how the bishops would deal with her. I think she was complicated for bishops to deal with back in her own day. And she was quite orthodox on theological matters. I think she was pro-life. I have no idea what she would do right now with the abortion question, but my guess is she would be pro-life. But I think she'd be pushing the bishops really hard on questions of war and social justice. But she'd probably be fed up with a lot of us, including liberals, if she were around today. But I am so glad you mentioned Dorothy Day, because I deeply admire her as well, even though, as I say, she is in the end much more radical than I am in her politics. Father.
Hi. In view of the debate that's getting pretty hot now about the going over the cliff and what we're going to do by the end of the year with the budgeting process and all that, and you mentioned that there two-thirds or something around two-thirds of Catholics were much more in favor of social justice issues and outreach in those programs for the poor, and contrast, say, with the principles of the hardcore principles of abortion and life, pro-life type stance. How is that going to measure out when there must be some very serious effort to deal with this budget business? And where would we Catholics be, I guess, maybe the bishops, how are they going to deal with the fact that we're all in favor of social justice and all that, but they also want to try to stick up for principles that have to do with life? And is it measured by dollars, and is it measured by budget type matter, or is there a place to stick, hold fast, just the principles of life?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it does seem to me that upholding the principles of life involve upholding assistance to the poor. They certainly involve upholding Medicaid for the sick. They involve, I think, upholding food stamps so people don't go hungry. I think all this has to do with the right to life. Barney Frank used to say that his opponents believe that life begins at conception and ends at birth. And that is not the Catholic position. The Catholic position is birth to natural death, and that the Church actually has, over many, many years, stood up on these budget questions. When I was critical of the welfare reform that was passed in the mid-90s, I was for welfare reform. I am for pro-work welfare, but I felt that the bill that was before President Clinton was not, didn't give enough to the poor in exchange for the work requirement. That was my view at the time. The Catholic Church was one of the only groups that was there really critical of aspects of that bill for being too punitive. The bishops put out a very strong statement critical of the Ryan budget. I think the question is, so I think they will be there, and there's a great guy who just left the bishops' conference, John Carr, who was in charge of peace and justice, along with Jim Wallace and people from Bread for the World, a great organization, a great ecumenical organization on behalf of Hungary, put together something called the Circle of Protection. And if you actually look at the sequester that will take effect on the 1st of January, there are a whole lot of programs for the poor that were excluded from the sequester, including food stamps and several other programs. So they're going to be there, I think, the bishops. The question is, how strongly will they be there? I have a friend who's worked on issues of poverty in Washington for many, many years, and he said that there are still Catholics now lobbying, but the bishops aren't as visible as they used to be. So they put out the statements, but they're not as visible. And I think one of the ways the bishops could heal some of the wounds of this election would be to be out there very strongly on the social justice questions. This is not asking them to compromise. This is asking them to stand up for their own positions. And so I hope they will be there on these questions. And I think some of them will be. And there are still some bishops who are very passionate about the social justice questions. But I'd like to see all of them stand up. And we're going to see what happens. And I think that is going to be one of the issues that I suspect they're talking about at this bishops' meeting. And just for fun, I wanted to share with you a story about my friend John Carr. His job with the bishops for many years was in the Peace and Justice Office. And John once found himself in an elevator at a bishops' meeting. And a woman saw he worked for the bishop. She said, "Oh, that's great. What do you do?" And he said, well, she saw a sign, said, "Why are you here?" "I'm here for a bishops' meeting." "What do you do?" "I work for the bishops." "What do you do for the bishops?" "So I work on peace and justice." And the woman looked at him and scolded him and said, "You're not doing a very good job." Sir.
I may have missed this when you were talking about your culture wars and things, but I'd like to hear your ideas on what motivates conservatives, or what's some of the problems there? Are they afraid, or both in the church and politically? You know, I'm old enough now that I think some of my relatives, younger relatives, when I was younger, they would have been for FDR, but now they're rabidly, you know, these guys are out of work. They're construction workers. They're against, you know, Obama or anything that you whisper of liberalism. Anyway, I'm just curious about your ideas about what motivates conservatives.
A couple of things. One is there are many different kinds of conservatives motivated by many different kinds of things, and there are conservatives motivated out of interest. There are, you know, out of economic interests. There are conservatives who are sort of libertarian in their economic views, and some of them extend it to other issues, including gay rights and abortion. There are social conservatives who are traditionalists and concerned with a traditional agenda. Let me try to put this as, I think that one of the things I think all of us need to do, I wish they would do it with us, we ought to do it with them, is to sort of try to look at people from how they might look at themselves or how they might describe their own situation. I think for a lot of cultural and religious conservatives, there is a sense that the certain things that they thought could be taken for granted cannot be taken for granted anymore. And they experience this, from their point of view, as a loss and is dangerous for our culture. I think, you know, what they would argue, I think, is we used to be able to pray in the public schools and we can't anymore. We used to be able to, you know, debate abortion and have a popular judgment on it. Now the court took that ability away from us. We are mistreated by the media, as particularly, you know, by liberals in the universities. They treat us as a bunch of stupid yahoos who don't know anything. And so I think there's a whole kind of a set of resentments that build up in response to real changes and fears, some of which are I think legitimate. I mean, I think we in the, you know, I say this as somebody in the academy. You know, the academy is not always very friendly to religious people, which is one of the reasons I appreciate the fact that Colorado State is doing this. Liberals aren't always friendly to religious people. Remember that cartoon, it was very funny in its way, and it had a certain accuracy, but it was also offensive, that cartoon after the 2004 election that showed the Kerry states united with Canada, and that was called the United States of Canada, and the rest of the country was called Jesus Land. You know, and it was amusing, but if you're a religious conservative and you look at that and you say, what do those guys make of us? So I think from their point of view, that's something like that is going on, and they think it's bad for the country, all this cultural change. Now, is there fear? Sure, fear is some of it. Is there racism? Well, of course there's racism out there. But I think it's a great mistake to say the whole opposition to Obama or all of conservatism is rooted in racism. Just as I argue with my conservative friends, don't try to tell me there is no racism there, because there is. So that is certainly part of it. And so I guess that's my take on it. I still find, having said all that, I find the ferocious hatred of the president really astonishing. I find it astonishing because this is fundamentally a moderate guy. I mean, whenever I hear Obama called a socialist, I always say, look, I know socialists, and they're insulted when Barack Obama is called a socialist. I mean, this is a moderate guy. This is a culturally moderate guy. You look at that family, and this is a pretty traditional-looking family. This is a guy who did everything we tell somebody to do to advance. And so I don't fully get it in the end, and I find it really troublesome. And I'd love some of the conservatives whom you're talking about to take another look at the guy. This is not, he has probably done more for veterans. This administration has been really out there trying to look out for veterans. It needs to do more, by the way. But, so there's some of it that I don't get, and the easy thing to do is say, well, and then it must be racism. But I don't think it's just that. There's something very peculiar about the reaction to Obama that will probably give scholars at this and other great universities a lot to study for the next 50 years. But thank you for the question.
I'm curious your thoughts on it. Is it a grassroots movement in terms of their political statements that they have and power, or is it something more kind of top-down, kind of cynical manipulation from their leaders?
The evangelical movement, I think, is to a very significant degree a bottom-up movement, but it's the religious right itself was a top-down movement. And by that I mean that if you go back to the origins of the moral majority, this didn't arise spontaneously out of the churches. It was a group of, and this story is well known, it was a group of conservative political types, Morton Blackwell, a Republican National Committeeman from Virginia, Paul Weyrich, the late Paul Weyrich, who was a very prominent conservative leader in Washington, who realized that all these evangelical votes were either not being cast at all or had gone in 1976 for Jimmy Carter. And they figured that with issues like abortion and school prayer and new regulations of religious universities and the like, there was a whole movement to be organized. So they actually went to Jerry Falwell and kind of offered him the leadership of this organization, and he decided to take it on. And so there is always a top-down element to this movement. But I think for a lot of the people in the conservative churches, this is a kind of now an organic movement. It's a view shared by large numbers of white evangelicals across a variety of churches. Many Baptists, many non-denominational evangelical churches, so to some degree it's self-organizing. I think the Tea Party is a bit like that, although I sense that there was more top-down there in the sense of the financing in particular coming from a small number of people who saw how powerful this could be on behalf of a conservative anti-government agenda. But I think that in the longer run, you're seeing some of the limits on the Christian right movement or the Christian conservative movement. They're still very important in Republican primaries. They still wield a lot of power in certain states. But they, the results of the last two elections show the limits of their power. And also, I think that the public's view on the social issues has become more moderate or more liberal. I was telling a group of students and professors before, think back to the 1972 campaign when Richard Nixon ran against George McGovern on acid, amnesty, and abortion. Well, in this election, it wasn't acid, but marijuana was legalized in several states. Abortion, it was the first campaign where really a Democratic candidate very aggressively used a pro-choice position on abortion to rally some piece of the electorate. And amnesty, while not for draft resistors, as we were talking about it then, but I think the cause of amnesty for illegal undocumented immigrants was very much advanced in this election. And so I think, and then the last thing is the Christian conservative movement tends to be significantly older than the population as a whole. I think younger evangelicals are still quite conservative, but not as uniformly so. They were more open to Obama in 2008. They care a lot about poverty in the third world and other questions. So I think there's going to be some ferment on that side, and that the movement has hit a kind of peak. Even though, as I say, it'll still be very influential in many state Republican parties.
Could you comment briefly on this so-called gender gap, which, as I understand it, when you start breaking down what information we have, is a lot more complex, with old white women like me voting for Governor Romney and young single women thinking there was a war on women voting for President Obama?
Yeah, no, it is very complex. There is a marriage gap as well as a gender gap. So married women tend to be much more conservative than single women. So the big margins for Obama came from single women. You know, there is also there are actually more minority women than there are minority men in the electorate, and so that also adds to the gender gap. And the third thing is, it is not, nonetheless, it is there. I mean, there was a very sizable difference, and in some states, it was really, really big in the Senate races. The example that comes to mind, and they may have adjusted the exit polls slightly, but on election night, Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts lost men by 9 points and won women by 19 points. Now that is a gender gap. And you saw that to a lesser degree. I remember in the Maggie Hassan race, Maggie Hassan elected governor in New Hampshire, there was men went one way, women went the other way by a large margin. So it is real. And some of it is the reproductive rights issues, but a lot of it is also a very different attitude toward government. That women tend to be more sympathetic to the compassionate state than men are. Men tend to be more free market oriented. I've always said that libertarianism is the perfect ideology of the single 25-year-old reasonably affluent white man who just wants to be left alone, doesn't want the government to get in his way, do anything for him. It's suddenly, when you have families get older, government sort of becomes a factor in your head again. It's Bill Cohen, the great liberal Republican senator who served in the Clinton administration, once said, "Government is the enemy until you need a friend." And I think women tend to share very much share that attitude. So it's a whole panoply. They tend to care more about issues that tend to be more democratic issues like education. So there are a whole lot of things that go into the gender gap. Also, women live longer than men, so there are more women who very much need Medicare and Social Security, although older voters now are the most Republican constituency in the country, since the New Deal generation has largely passed to its eternal reward. Yes, the great AAA in the sky, or CCC. Sir.
EJ, when you started out, you talked about a parallel between Vatican II and the current day, and I see one that I'd like you to comment on. To me, Vatican II was not only inclusive, it gave people credit for their conscience, their intelligence, their personal integrity in a way that was unfamiliar to them. And it was quite refreshing. Of late, some of the things that have been done in the church make some of us feel like that confidence has been lost by the people who govern the church from above, the hierarchical society. In our current political situation, particularly at the end of the campaign, the preponderance of negative ads, things appealing to fear, that gave us no credit for intelligence or an attention span that would let us deal with properly constructed information, something more than a soundbite, seemed to be almost total. There was no credit given that we could consider and digest something that was positive or more complex. With all the complexity of the issues, I guess it's almost understandable, but could you comment on the fact that in two cases we have essentially a hierarchy that seems to have no confidence in the people in an ability to take more facts and to consider them carefully and to do something with them? They seem to appeal to fear and go for a short burst that's designed to send them scurrying.
That's really mean to bishops to compare them to a 30-second TV ad. I'm still parsing that because let me try to answer them separately, and maybe I can bring them together, and maybe I can't. Just on Vatican II, you're absolutely right about the authority that Vatican II extended to lay Catholics. I mean, one of the famous lines out of Vatican II is, "The people are the church." And now you have the bishops really trying to assert what I see as rather unprecedented kinds of authority. The example to me that really crossed the line was when they, on the health care bill, when they argued that not only if the health care bill had included support, public support for abortion, then from their own point of view, I could see why they would oppose it. But the people who wrote the bill, the people who wrote the amendments so it wouldn't fund abortion, said it didn't fund abortion. The pro-choice community, which was very unhappy about it, said it didn't fund abortion. I spent hours talking to people in the church to try to figure out where they saw the bill funding abortion. I just don't see it. But the bishops insisted that not only did we have to accept their guidance on a political question, but they went several steps farther than they'd ever done, which was to say we had to accept their legal reading of a bill that somebody like Sister Carol Keehan, the head of the Catholic Health Association, said, no, the bill doesn't say that. That's troublesome to me. And I think it's something they ought to think about, because that's not, that's a demand beyond what they had asked for before. And I think that there is an effort being made to sort of say, and you've seen it in some of their statements, that essentially, once the bishop speaks, that's the end of the question. And that is certainly not a democratic spirit, and they will argue, okay, the church is not a democracy. But Vatican II certainly put kind of democratic ideas, I think, at the heart of Catholic Catholic teaching, at the heart of the church itself. And I think rather than run away from that, we should re-embrace it, and bishops should re-embrace it. And there's, again, the contrast between the 80s and now, where when the bishops put out those statements, conservatives were very critical of them, but they were very much involved in the consultative process. The bishops went out to the country, consulted with people, and then later conservatives put out their own counter documents, and that was fine. The bishops didn't condemn them for that. Mike Novak and Jim Wilson and some great conservative Catholic thinkers put out an alternative economic letter. And we had this raucous discussion as Catholics. Shutting conversation down on basic political questions just does not strike me as a good path, and I hope they don't pursue it. Now, in terms of the campaign, yes, I mean, but we've been bemoaning these kinds of ads for a long time. I mean, this campaign was not unique for its political ads. President Obama ran many more political negative ads against Romney than we remember. I mean, against McCain 4 years ago than we remember. Both sides ran a lot of them. And yeah, the campaign looked small and all of that. But I actually think, I actually think that this was a campaign about fundamental principles, and the American people understood that. I mean, we were having a fundamental argument about who are we. We were having a fundamental argument about what is government's role. We were having a very basic argument about whether the free market all by itself can solve our problems, or whether we need some other mechanisms, including government, to solve them. We were talking about whether the market should be regulated. We were talking about how the burdens of taxation should be levied. And I think Americans understood that this was a very big debate. Now, yeah, there is something defective about the political advertising system. I've said for a long time that if our commercial products advertised the way politicians do, the politicians are the only profession in the country that spends most of its money advertising against itself. That it would be as if McDonald's said, don't go to Burger King, they'll poison you. Or don't fly that airline, they'll crash. Or name a finance company and the tagline is too much embezzlement for too long. So there is something crazy about this. And I'd like to get away from it. But there's a vicious cycle here, because people are so cynical about politics and politicians that they're much more likely to believe the nasty thing you say about the guy they hate. And look into yourself in this. I bet it's true, you and me. They're more likely to believe the negative thing about the person they hate than the positive claim of the person they like. And lastly, there were some positive ads in this campaign. I actually think it was very important to Obama's reelection that he ran a couple of those ads laying out a program, saying, I do have a program for the second term, a couple of minutes saying, here's what I stand for. So, I don't know. I think that I like to see better campaigns. I'd like to see better debates. I'd like to see people a little nicer to each other. But politics is often tough, and we had really big, tough issues on the table, and we decided them. And I have to say, in the end, I'm very glad we decided them the way we decided them. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Oh, that's so nice of you. Thank you. Thank you. Bless you all. Thanks.